Welcome to Courage to Advance, Leadership in Transformation. I'm your host, Kim Bohr, and I'm joined today by Mason Donovan, a longtime friend and former colleague. And we're here today to talk about leading through polarization. And before we dive in, let me tell you a little bit about Mason. So he is a global inclusion strategist and managing partner of the Dagoba Group, an integrated global corporate culture engagement consulting practice with specialties in inclusive leadership, wellness, unconscious bias, work-life balance, workplace dynamics, and client engagement. He's also the author of 3 books, The Golden Apple, The Inclusion Dividend, and Set for Inclusion. I am so thrilled to have you here and excited for our conversation today. Mason, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure being here. It's an honor being here with you and your listeners. I look forward to our conversation.
I think our listeners are going to really appreciate what we're going to talk about today. And although we've talked a little bit about what that'll be, we're going to just lean into where our conversation goes. And just so our listeners know, we're recording this just days before the U.S. presidential election, and we can all, probably agree that there's high emotion. There feels like high stakes, regardless of what side you're on, and there's a real opportunity to try to understand, how do we move through this, not knowing what the outcomes are going to be, and yet we all still have to work and live together in pursuit of common goals that we share. And so this felt like a really important conversation that you and I wanted to have in order to just talk through what's going on and trying to see if we can bring to our listeners perhaps some tips and some ideas of way to think to try to bridge that polarization that we all are, just the reality of our society today. So from that perspective, I'd love for you to start to talk a little bit about what has brought you into the work of inclusion, and really where do you come at, especially in this type of time that we're in?
Sure. First, I want to make a bold prediction, though. So this
Okay.
this podcast will drop a couple of weeks after the election. So my bold prediction is by then we will know who is the president. So
I think that is a good
that's my
prediction.
bold
Yes,
prediction.
I think so.
Probably not the day after.
Agreed. We definitely feel we definitely can agree that is not going to be a
As far
clear
as I'm not
yes.
saying not that night. So, yeah, we are living in a world polarization. I think there's not a single person out there that doesn't feel it. It's in our personal life, but it seeps into our work life, right? So, how do you keep that outside conversation, either keep it from coming inside, or when it does come inside, how do you keep that from really deteriorating sort of the inclusive teamwork that you've created as a corporation? So I'll go back to the question you have. What drew me to into inclusion is that we both worked for a company called careerbuilder.com.
Where we met,
Yeah,
yes, many years ago.
many years ago. It was a really dynamic company, but it had, I'm not sure if you agree, but I'll say it had a bro culture. What we would say is
Yes.
sort of even though it wasn't Silicon Valley, it had that Silicon Valley, what you have, bro culture. And I can tell you, as a gay man in that organization and not being out, feeling like I could never come out because it just didn't ever feel like it fit the culture. There was inclusion at the time. I didn't fully understand what it meant to me personally, but also the organization. And there was a time when we created a human capital consulting firm when I started working for them, and we started to outsource some inclusion work. And that's when I really started to lean in and understanding, what is inclusion? Why is it important to me? How does it make me feel? But also, how does it connect me with the company? So I leaned more into it. And it wasn't too long after that, I realized I had a big passion for it and what it could do to allow somebody to be fully realized in their life. And so we ended up, I joined with my partner, Mark Kaplan. We created the Dagoba Group. And from there, we really started to leaning, and it bled into so many other areas that I am passionate about within the organization. And obviously we think of talent acquisition, but there's talent assessment, there is the client engagement, there's product creation. There's so many stories in where inclusion has really created a inclusion dividend, as the name of the book is, created that dividend that's paid back many times over. And for me personally, I saw it myself and how once I was able to bring my full self to work, how that made me more productive, how it increased my morale, increased my connection to the corporation. And I see that with our clients as well. And when they have a more inclusive workplace, what that means for everyone. And when I mean everyone, whether it is you find yourself in the majority stakeholder group or the minority stakeholder group. Inclusion is really for the entire organization. So that's really sort of my lean in within inclusion, how I get connected. On the point of view for our corporation, we really look at inclusion of a way that can advance a company forward. So there are three types of inclusion firms out there. There's the academic, the civil, and the corporate. So the academic are like like Dr. Banaji, that's really studying about unconscious bias. How does it impact our brains? How does it impact our decisions? Daniel Kahneman does the same thing. Is that whole academic world's really doing that strong research that we use. The civil world is, in the civil world, what they're doing is really trying to push the legislation to be more inclusive. Sort of out there and really working a lot of organizations out there, whether there's HRC or NOW or NAACP, they're there to create a more equitable workplace and society, and they're there to really change legislation. And then there's the corporate, and that's where we sit. And that's how can we fully leverage our people to advance our company, to make our company better than it was before, or if you're a nonprofit, to advance towards your mission. So that's how we look at it, and it's really about an actionable, going beyond awareness. So because we think awareness is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You have to move to action, and it has to be in alignment with the path forward for your company overall.
And I absolutely agree with you where that culture we came from was very much that bro culture, and it really did limit so many different areas of innovation. And I think that lack of inclusion, it was certainly a predominant reason why. And so when I think about the work you do with organizations, what you've shared with me before, and I think would be interesting just to elaborate on a little bit further with our listeners, is that it's beyond just policy setting. It's really operating from a lens of inclusion in every aspect of an organization. And so I'd love to have you just share a little bit about that, because I think that is perhaps a little bit different than the way some people think of inclusion, in maybe stopping just at a policy level.
Sure, and it's about putting inclusion anytime there is a people decision or a people challenge. Inclusion should be part of that thought process. I give you an example. We had a company we're working with who are working with them on inclusive leadership. They called me up and just out of the blue say, "Hey, we're building a brand new headquarters." So this is a very large Fortune 1000 company. We're building new headquarters. And we're thinking about how the conversations we had with you, how inclusion should be part of part of our everyday conversation. We think we never looked at the build out from an inclusive lens. We just looked at it from a functional lens.
Yeah.
Could you come in and speak to us about, and we have a design team, we have those interested, to talk about the building of our headquarters. And I'd love that. We had a great conversation. We did visioning of them, like walking in, what do they see, what do other people see? Because diversity goes beyond just sort of those 5 or 6 or 7 dimensions of difference you typically see in an EEO statement, right? They go beyond that. They go to areas such as parents and non-parents. They go to areas like introverts and extroverts. They go to areas of economic class. And when you're building out this headquarters, which will be their headquarters for the next 30, 40, 50
Yeah.
years, they need to look beyond what is our functional need today, but what is our need for our people socially? Like, do we need social groups? Do we need pods? How do we work with that? How can we make this flexible enough to build for the future? And it's always interesting when somebody thinks about, well, we're spending a lot of money to build for this small group of people. And it always reminds me of the ADA, so the American with Disabilities Act. They came in and said that we need to make corporations, we need to make, not corporations, we need to make spaces, building spaces more accessible to those that have some ableness challenges, those that are on crutches or in wheelchairs or whatnot. And so what do I happen? They put in cuts into the sidewalks. They put wheelchair ramps in. They put in elevator space. They probably put in some bathroom stalls that were bigger. And guess what happened? The majority of people using them was not the target audience. So
Mm.
I remember doing an audit once for a company. We sat outside for 3 hours, and all we did is look at the front of their building after they built a ramp. And the people who were using it, whereas it was 90% did not have ableist challenge. It was a delivery guy. It was a person coming with the bike. It was somebody pushing a baby carriage. It was, the list went on and on. There's somebody that might have sprained their ankle that weekend, or somebody had a lot of roll-on luggage to going in and out for business. So when we build out, we got to think of, all the additional impacts, how this impacts everyone and not just that particular group. And another clear example of that, another one with it, I used to travel quite a bit, and I remember sometimes I would need to change my clothes in the airport because I'd go in there and go to another firm or heading home, and the only stall you could do that was in the handicap stall.
Mhm.
And I would find, oh wow, the majority of people going to those stalls or actually ones that were changing or had suitcase or other things with them. And one thing I always make sure, if I'm using this, I make sure that nobody else is there. So if somebody else did have a need, a verified need for that stall, that's used for them. But it just gives you another idea of when we're building something out for individuals, it's
Mhm.
entire group. When we think of maternity leave, and then we think of paternity leave, and then we think, oh, wait, what it really is, it's really caregiver leave. And when you
Right.
start thinking that and moving back and taking a broader range of what the leave is for, and the leave is for to caring for a loved one. Sometimes that might be a elderly mother or father that's living with us, or an adult child that needs more help and more care, or it might be a newborn baby or adopted baby. So when we start looking at these policies, how it impacts the entire organization and how it can really start to have a huge impact on, us as a community within the corporation, as well as, the productivity, the morale, how that really moves a company forward. So yeah, inclusion is not just about sort of our traditional approach to diversity. Like we need to get X number of women in, or we need to
Mhm.
represent the society and percentage of this particular group or another. It's really about how we feel. It's really about that climate that then allows, and inclusion is something that you can lead with globally. If 50% of our clients are outside the US, inclusion you can lead with globally. And then you can allow for the diversity challenges at hand, because your diversity challenges in London are probably going to be different than they are in DC or Taipei or Tokyo, or even within your department. I can tell you the diversity challenges of almost any organization for their HR support department are going to be very different from their technical service department or the sales department. So inclusion allows for that diversity challenge locally. Then you can have this like a consistent approach for everyone and a guideline to go by.
I think that's so important how you've described it, because it's really at the heart of the design. And it doesn't sound like it's housed in one particular functional area. It's really in the way you describe it, and what you encourage clients to think about is everybody has a piece of ownership in this area of thinking from an inclusive place by how we think about designing for the business and everybody in it, not just from a, not just a sole function of maybe an HR lens.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes perhaps where this conversation gets stalled, because it is maybe thought to live there versus everybody has a piece of ownership in it.
Yeah, I agree. It's, we all need to own it. We can't just put it on the shoulders of the leaders, and we can't just put it on the shoulders of who has D&I in their title. I typically have a metaphor. I will ask a client, or if we're in a workshop, how many here have digital security in their title? Maybe one hand might go up. And I say, okay, how many here feels though digital security, data security is part of your responsibility? Every hand goes up.
Mhm.
Because if we only allowed and focus on that one person that had digital security, they're the only ones that worried about digital security and the only ones that cared about it. Well, guess what? You would not
Yeah.
have a secure data. You would not have a secure site. You would not have sort of secure systems, because that the first time somebody hits one of those scam emails or gives information away on the phone when they shouldn't have, then it's gone. So everybody has to own it. Another example, safety. We used to work with DuPont, who's now owned by Dow, and I remember the walking up. They had this grand staircase in Delaware, and the CEO was walking up, and she had things in both arms, and somebody stopped her right away. Somebody just out of the blue stopped her and say, "Hey, you can't do that. You have to hold on to the railing." They had a rule, a safety rule, that if you're
Mhm.
going up the steps, you have to have one hand on the railing. And the CEO said, "Thank you. You're right." And then she asked somebody if they can hold the other thing that was in her hand, and she walked out with the hand on the railing. And it was that individual that had because the company owned safety so much, that had the power to stop a CEO of a Fortune 500 company
Mhm.
from making that step. And the CEO received it really well, in the way you expect. So that's ownership, right? And same thing comes through
Yes.
inclusion, diversity, inclusion. Everybody has to own inclusion, whether you're the entry level person or you're the
Mhm.
CEO. Obviously, as leaders, you have a much greater impact and influence on the culture, as those individuals, but you can't be the only one that's carrying that bucket.
Right. Right. And I think that's such a powerful example of that in action. And so thinking about what we have in front of us today, we are well aware of CEOs that are perhaps more public figures that are really taking very maybe polarizing, stances.
Mm.
And it's that maybe starts to become a conflict, right? With what is maybe stated or implied or intended. And so I think the example you gave is such a great example of alignment. And yet maybe a lot of our listeners are feeling that's not the kind of environment that they're in. And so how do we how do we start to think about when there is this clear, you know, do as I say, not as I do
Mm.
type of a situation that pops up where we all feel so I don't know, maybe there's this sense of like fairness that starts to creep in, especially when we're seeing the dynamics at play. So how do you start to address that type of scenario?
It's corporate culture is really started from CEO on down. And there is a culture of Simon Says in every organization. So if you remember the game of Simon Says, and when I did my research on that a long time ago, I found that Simon Says is actually played in almost every country around the world.
Oh,
They have
wow.
a different name for it, somebody else says, but it's the same exact game. And as we remember, Simon Says, what happens is the leader does something different, but tells you to do, say, they'll tell you to pat your stomach, but they'll pat their head. And we lose by doing what they do instead of doing what they say. And because we are just trained as humans, so often we follow the leader. And so if your leader is saying one thing but doing another, we're going to follow what they do. We're not going to follow what they say. And so it becomes difficult. So we talk about polarization. There are leaders out there of CEOs of organizations that are very public with their political stance. They might, even within their organization, have a policy of not talking about politics. You know, it gets sticky because CEOs are people too, and they deserve to have their own personal opinions and their own political preferences. And so there's that one argument is that they have their own personal life.
Mhm.
But when you're a head of organization, unfortunately, you give up a lot of that. Everything that you do in public is a representative of that organization. So I could just call one out, Elon Musk. We all know that Elon
Yeah.
Musk, the head of Tesla and of X and other companies, is very outspoken. I think people know he's a very outspoken individual. And so the idea is, the concept is, if you have a CEO like Elon Musk that's very outspoken and very outspoken of who he favors and how strongly
Mhm.
he favors, if you have individuals within your organization that don't agree with him, is there the safety to say that without reprisal? And those who do agree with them, do they feel more emboldened to be more political within the workspace because the CEO is doing it?
Mhm.
And so why can't I do it? The CEO is doing it. So that becomes a sticky wicket for the manager, because the
Mhm.
manager of the organization realized to have inclusion, you really have to have a term we can discuss further on, psychological safety. People have to feel as though being themselves and being able to express themselves without the fear of reprisal. It's interesting because in diversity inclusion, often you hear that we're doing this to bring your full self to work. We want your whole self, full self to work.
Mhm.
Well, I always say, well, not fully, right? Because our full self is, some of us are very political outside of work. Some of us are very religious outside of work. Some of us have maybe a vocabulary that we would typically not use in work. And when organizations say bring your full self, what they really want to say is bring your full professional self, right? You realize
Yeah.
you're in a profession, you're in a community of colleagues in which you have to have respect. In order for us to all work together, you have to have respect. And you have to look at some clear boundaries of where conversations go beyond the professional. Some are just legal. There are just some things that you
Yep.
don't say that you're just going to get, you're crossing line,
Yeah.
you are going to open yourself up to all kinds of litigation. But then there's stuff that's in the gray area, like talking about politics. So it's it is challenging for the manager. It's challenging for a manager when you have an outspoken CEO on one way or another, whether it's a one side of the party or another party.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter which party it is. And how do you make it a safe, inclusive space for those who might disagree with that or have whole different opinions, as well as those who do agree that also might feel like they can't speak as much as they can because of the policies. So I
Mhm.
think one of the things we look at with organization when this comes up to hand is it's not a surprise. The election's
Yeah.
coming. The election is not a surprise. It happens every 4 years when it comes to presidential election. Every 2 years, we're having some type of other election at the rep or the senator level. So get ahead of it. Create policies. Understand that the outside talk, when it becomes so passionate, we get close to the election like we are now, it's going to happen. People are nervous. Both sides are nervous. Both sides, and in the end, one side will win and one side will
Mhm.
lose. And we're talking about the parties. Hopefully, everybody wins, and whoever is elected,
Yes.
works for all of us.
Right.
But one party will win and one party will lose for that presidential spot. That's just how it works. And they
Well, and
will.
that's the heart of our democratic institution,
It
right?
is,
Is
and
the competition and the ideas that there's going to be a trade-off, and hopefully we get into the where
yeah,
we're
and
all
hope,
trading off something that we gain something too.
yeah, you do. And then you sort of either you cry, or you scream, whatever you need to do, brush yourself off, and you move forward with what you have. But within the organizational space, it's coming. So get ahead of that conversation. create some policies that in place of, do you allow firm attire? Do you allow political slogans on
Hmm.
attire coming into work? Not just coming into work. If you are a hybrid or remote organization, do you allow that what's in the personal space? Like if I had a political presidential sign behind me, is that allowable? Get that ahead of time. Put those out in policies,
Hmm.
communicate with that, and understand, talk to people, open communication, and realize that they will say, hey, I recognize there's a lot of passion out there during this time. And we want to talk about it, but we also have to respect each other and realize after the election's over, we're still working together. We're still in the same
Yeah.
organization and we still have the same goals. Regardless of who wins the election, our goal is XYZ for this corporation or for this nonprofit mission. But as a CEO and understanding, and as a leader organization, understanding your actions, no matter what the intent, have a huge impact. Now, I'm going to bring something up that you and I discussed before.
Yes,
Behind you, you have two pictures.
I do.
Um, I want to ask you, why do you have RBG and MLK behind you? So what's the reasoning for you to have that? And you're a CEO of your organization. These are behind you. These individuals are behind you in this talk, and I'm assuming other business talk. Uh, Tell me why they're there. What do they mean to you personally?
Yeah, so actually as the president and COO of the organization, what I found in and back during I think it was during the pandemic. And one of the things that I had a friend who, as an outlet during the pandemic, when we were all shut in, started painting these pictures. And she started doing everything from, musicians all the way through some political figures. And when I happened to see these two that she had posted, and was sharing online, I was really drawn to them. And what I was drawn to was the essence of the values that I shared with what they stood for, the the doors that they opened, that the work that they had to do, that was really hard work to give all of us better opportunities. And so when I saw these, I was really drawn to them. And I felt that so much of the work, even what we do at Spark Effect, we very much are working to help broaden the conversation, help leaders find understanding, not just growth for themselves, but growth with their team and alignment into their organizations. And so I felt that it was very much aligned with my values and the values of our organization and the brand. And what was really interesting as you and I started talking about this topic and this moment, I had this light bulb moment together where when we were talking around, oh, maybe I'm as much as I feel like what I reflect doesn't feel political to me, it feels like a supportive, kind of more historically supportive of movement that has been around inclusion.
Mhm.
Maybe that's not the full message I'm sending to those who join me in this setting that maybe don't see it the same way. And that was really eye-opening to me in our brief conversation we had as we were talking about this, because I hadn't thought of that way. And I
Yeah,
had my own maybe blind spot, if you will.
yeah, it's we're talking about sort of our to go with we have a methodology when you're making a decision. It's called SET, self-awareness, engage, listen to, and tailor. So the self-awareness is what we when we started having this conversation, you're like, oh wait, it's something I didn't even think about these pictures behind me because it's of everything you just mentioned, they align with what you say, align with how the company works, with how Spark Effect looks at things, moving people forward, opening doors. And then the Engage system too, which is built off of what Daniel Kahneman made popular, which was system one is our really quick reactive decision making. It's really sort of the back of the head thinking, and the majority of our decisions during the day are made that way, that are made, and they're usually fairly accurate. except when it comes to people. When it comes to people decisions, they're not so accurate because we're going off of sort of our biases that our experiences we've had, and we stop looking at the individual when we think, make decisions on our experience with the group. And so system two is when we really have to reflect and stop and reflect. I always tell people it's like if you drive home as a commute, every day, you probably sometimes you realize you get home, you're like, oh God, how did I get here? Did I go through stoplights?
Yeah.
Did I hit somebody?
Yeah.
You realize because you're on system one the whole time. System two is usually in the summer when all of a sudden there's a detour. And maybe you're on the call and you're like, hey, wait, hold on. I have to think. I have to figure out this is gone.
Yep.
That's system two, you're engaged in system two. So we talked about self-awareness. Engaged system two, we had this conversation like, okay, this is what you think about what they bring, but what else might they represent? And this conversation talking about polarization, they obviously represent the liberal side of sort of the party politics. Like the politics in the US have sort of put almost everything, every cultural decision on either the red or the blue. So I can say, why not have a picture of Clarence Thomas up there? He was another Supreme Court justice. There's a lot of things that he has done that people can say that opened up the door. But I can guarantee you somebody would associate Clarence Thomas very differently as they would Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They're both Supreme Court justices. They both served a long time. But they are connected very often to a one party or the other. And so the system two is, am I sending that message beyond there? And is this something that beyond what they stand for, beyond party, are they connecting to a party? And am I putting people off by having these if they're connecting politically to it? And then Taylor is the last part of this. Okay, then make a decision. We thought about it. You raised your self-awareness of what's going on. You thought about what you're doing, and now make decision. Take them up, put them down. And it's a really good sort of very quick and easy methodology to when you're thinking about making a decision. Now, CEOs, let's take Elon Musk as an example again. So Elon Musk is, as we said, is very public, and he's a good figure to use in these examples because he's very well known. He's very public. He's the head of a lot of the companies that we use or connected with, whether it's X or Tesla or one of the charging stations, anything that's connected to there. The self-awareness, some people would say, is something that he might lack. Does he fully understand what he's saying, how it impacts him? Now, I can tell you a lot of shareholders think what he's saying, he's not self-aware because it's impacting the sales of Tesla. That every time he tweets or says something that alienates a particular group of individuals, that's a group of individuals that won't buy another Tesla. And so there's that engaged system too of like, oh, wait, what am I saying? And how is that impacting sort of the overall corporation? Again, as a CEO, whatever you say is magnify 100 times.
Yeah.
Whatever you do is followed through. And you and I, as being in the heads of our organizations, what we do and say, and we think, well, we're not ahead of a 1,000, Fortune 1000, they still have an impact on who we work with and how we go about. So that's when we think of managers, when we think of even the manager level, we don't have to look at the CEO level. When we think of managers, what they do and what they say has a big oversized impact on their team than one of the individuals on their team. And it's really to kind of take themselves through that piece. And self-awareness is the first step, right?
Yeah.
So often we have friends and family like they're really well intended, but they just don't know how they're being received.
Right.
And in
Right.
fact, a lot of times we might think that with it's funny, a lot of people here say it about their mothers or their fathers, their parents. Oh, how can you say that? That's sort of the fun personal side, but we see it in the professional side too, right? We see things that might be a little off, and then we see things that are a lot off and have a huge impact. And one of the things we look at is the little off, are they happening a lot? Are there a lot of these sort of micro exclusions? Some people might call them microaggressions. We prefer micro exclusions. These things that people are saying, they don't know they're saying. Like they may call the younger people in their group kids. Their intent might be just fun. I have kids and I say kids, it's just sort of a fun way of saying it. but how are they
Yeah.
receiving it, right?
Yeah.
How are they receiving as full-grown adults that work in those organizations being called kids, or when women are called girls in an organization? Because men, I can tell you, I never hear them called boys in a corporation, and
Yes.
I can tell you that they're not going to like it. Um, but when people, a lot of times it's meant with good intent or no intent at all, like they don't think about it. It's not meant with ill intent. But as if these little things happen over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
these little sort of behaviors or words, that builds up over time, and there's this accumulation effect that then has an outside of impact on your team, on your organization, and your culture, regardless of your intent. I often will ask, tell somebody, okay, let's believe a CEO is talking to a group of shareholders. And the CEO said, well, we intended to make 36 cents a share. Well, we came in at 29 cents a share. Do the shareholders really care what the intent was?
Mm-hmm.
They understand, of course, the company wanted to do well, intended to do well. They really care about the impact.
Yes.
What was the result in the end? And that happens with when our actions, what we say, whether it's in the office, outside the office. So let's go back to polarization. When we're bringing politics and we're discussing politics in the office, what is the intent?
Yeah.
Is it intent to persuade somebody? Is it intent to, have camaraderie or just to off steam? But what is the impact of that?
So let's talk a little bit about how how do we address the reality that maybe it's not politics explicitly. So maybe somebody's not coming in as explicit, but yet we certainly know we come at something differently because we're sure, we're maybe on the opposite political spectrum, but yet what we find as we come together is that without talking politics, there's still really misaligned dynamics. And I know from the work we do when we do executive coaching with leaders and we're trying to help them look at impact,
Mhm.
there's so much around looking at it from a real what are the behavioral components, what are the behavioral elements of that are causing those the actions to try to get to creating a bigger understanding around self-awareness and inclusion. Yet that's one layer of it, but not everybody's going to have the luxury of an executive coach or somebody who's pointing that out. And so how do you suggest individuals who may be listening or they're saying it's not a specific political conversation, but there's clearly we do not see the world the same way, and now it feels like we're not even working in an aligned fashion.
Yeah, and we've seen that, and it could be something that just happened in society. So the killing of George Floyd, it wasn't political when it started. It was an event. It was a very sad, sad event, and tragic event that got a lot of people talking in the organization. It didn't have a red or a blue attachment to
Mhm.
it. It came with a lot of passion, and there was other incidents that happened time and time again after that. Um, but people needed to have the conversation in work, right? So they need to have the conversation, but then it would veer off. It would go veer off into politics or veer off
Mhm.
into other areas in which people are uncomfortable with that conversation. So, if you're an individual and you're not a manager of the organization, the best thing you can do is just tell somebody, hey, can we table this conversation? It's making me feel a little uncomfortable in the area. I'm not ready for this conversation within work. Can we talk about the AI project? Like
Mhm.
redirect gently, so gently put it aside and redirect the conversation to something that doesn't have that sort of passion or flair with it. If you are a manager, and then if it's something that keeps coming up, then you need to, as an individual contributor, you need to discuss it with your management team. And if it's something that is just not stopping, and if it's
Mhm.
making you feel, or if you see it's making somebody else feel um, left out or excluded, or really feeling like it's not a welcoming sort of conversation or culture. If you're a manager, you can do a lot more. especially if a manager that sets policies or procedures. And the first thing you need to do is, like I said before, is you need to get ahead of it,
Hmm.
understanding it's coming. If it's not this election, it's going to be the next. If it's not this incident, it's going to be another incident.
Yeah.
Um, and have a clear conversation. First thing you do is have this clear conversation. Say, we are a workplace of respect. Detail what that means. Detail what that means when we kind of, this is what we do. I remember that I used to work with Pfizer, and one of their, they had these values, and one of the values was no jerks.
Mm,
I
I like
loved it.
that.
It was just
That's
so
great.
plain and simple, no jerks. Just don't be a jerk. We don't want a jerk here. Um, and so, but it was very plain and simple. And I'm not saying adopt that, but I'm saying is they got ahead of it, right? And as a manager, you can get ahead. You know this conversation is going forward, or might come up at some point, and just explain what is our policy around conversations that make us feel uncomfortable, whether they're political or not. How do we manage that? And second is to provide training. It does
Yeah.
not come as something that is innate to us to handle these sensitive topics, because we're at home we talk about anything we want to talk about because we have family and we grow up with family, and you just say all kinds of things, right? And in the end, you can say, I'm sorry if something happened. You
Right.
can't do that in work. It doesn't work so much like that in work. So you really have to start to understand, let's develop our team, develop our managers how to manage difficult conversations, but also develop our entire team about what is an inclusive workplace, what is a
Hmm.
respectful workplace, and what does it mean to us, and what is sort of the actions around it, and what do you do when you come head to head when something's not inclusive, something's exclusive, and you can do it's sometimes it's very simple. Again, assume good intent. We always say assume good intent,
Right.
but there's sometimes the very simple things you can do. It could be something talking in a group meeting, and you notice that somebody that might be a little bit more introverted or shy, or it could be somebody that their native language is not the one that's being spoken at the table. And every time they go to say something, they get cut off. And it's not people cutting off because bad intent, but just the conversation's going that way, right? Everybody's
Hmm.
kind of jumping in, cutting everybody off. But this person, because they don't have the command of the language or don't have the sort of the extroverted character to put themselves out there, what they have to say is not heard. So what can you do about that? Well, an individual, whoever it is that notices that, can say, hey, you know what? Deborah has something to say. Can we all be quiet? Because I would like to hear what Deborah has to say. And give Deborah that space, or
I
John,
love that.
or Jose,
Yeah.
whoever it happens to be. Give them that space, right? To speak. So it could be something teaching your team and training your team and coaching your team to be able to do those very simple interruption techniques. So get ahead of what's getting out there, the conversation, create those policies, and let people understand what is respect, what is the conversation, where's the culture of your team. Second, provide training, and third, provide space and time for those conversations. So
Mm,
when I'll go back to the incident I talked about with the killing of George Floyd. It was a tragic, as I said, a tragic incident that happened, and people had to talk about it. You
right.
couldn't just quell it. People had to talk about it. So a lot of companies gave space. Okay, let's just they gave some safe space for people to talk about, just express what are you feeling? What does this mean to you? How does it impact you? And everybody else could just listen, right? Not
Hmm.
interrupt those individuals. And so people can really just have this safe space and time so they can express that, express their feelings. And then when they're outside of that space or that time, they can go about work and they don't feel as though they have this on their shoulders. So that third thing is really to give space and time when something comes up that you feel as though it has to be discussed within your organization. So those three things are something that an individual contributor can do at certain levels,
Hmm.
definitely a manager, and certainly as you go up in leadership chain, you can create as a corporate culture.
So let me ask, I want to ask just you to elaborate on one piece, and then I do want to spend a little bit of time before we wrap a little bit more on the individual lens. So
Sure.
back to the lens of, thinking about how you start to create these elements in an organization, especially when you're in a position of authority to do so. It sounds like there's an opportunity to take an inclusive approach by including some of these diverse perspectives in how you start to shape the boundaries and the policies just very much as you said, when you think about it from a design perspective, even in a literal, physical building,
Sure.
is that something that you would certainly recommend also as a best practice?
Yeah, and I certainly, and another thing I didn't mention is that companies, when they're looking at what they want to respond to, what are their mission, what's aligned
Hmm.
with their mission, they don't have to respond to everything. You
Yeah.
don't have to respond to every incident that's out there. You don't have to respond to everything that happens in the world, because when you do, what will happen, and if it's not aligned with the mission, you'll forget your audience. Remember your audience, right? Remember
Yes.
who the audience, whether it's that your clients or your talent pool. Remember who that is and who you're in line with. I give you an example. So we've done a lot of work with Goldman Sachs. We did a lot of work with them in the LGBTQ plus space. They decided not only that they were very conscious that they wanted an inclusive space with that dimension difference within the workspace, but they also took a decision, a very conscious decision, that they were going to take a position outside the organization and publicly. But this is well thought out, really well within their mission and alignment. And they wrote during the Defense of Marriage Act, when it was at the Supreme Court, they wrote an amicus brief to overturn DOMA, which would allow same-sex marriage. So it was something they were very much in alignment and understanding where it was with the mission, and it wasn't something that was just knee-jerk. It came up and
Hmm.
they decided to do that. When DOMA was overturned, they flew the pride flag from the headquarters. And so it was something that was very much to their core of what
Yeah.
they believed inclusion, how it aligned with their mission internally and externally. If you don't have those conversations, if you're a PR team, your DEI team, your HR team, your marketing and sales team, don't have that conversation up front, you will find yourself knee-jerking reaction to everything that comes your way,
Hmm.
especially if you are a consumer facing organization, right?
Yeah, and I think you and I were talking about a great example that I think our listeners will remember, which was the Coors Light experience that they had.
Yeah.
And I think, when you and I think that just really resonates that, knowing your audience and trying to create alignment needs to be done, in from that place of true understanding, and not necessarily trying to, I don't know, it's like make a, perhaps wish for something that is impossible. So for our listeners that maybe don't remember, Coors Light,
I think it
uh,
was Bud Light, if
was
I'm
it Bud
right.
Light?
I think it was Bud Light.
Oh, I think you're
I'm not a beer
correct.
drinker, but I'm pretty sure it
I
was Bud Light.
I think you're correct. It was Bud Light. So excuse me for Coors Light. It was Bud Light. And what they had done was they decided to do some custom uh, cans with a trans influencer who, which was very much outside of the audience. It was outside of the audience who consumes the product, and they took a very bold statement in doing so, and then received quite a extensive backlash
They
from
lost market share.
the
They
community and lost market share.
they
Yeah,
lost.
very much so.
Yeah, they used to be the lead beer, and they dropped. They lost market share. It hurt their stock. And you're right. It's where companies sort of forgot who the audience was. Now, the intent was to be inclusive. Awesome, great intent. But the way that they went about it, and pursuing out there, it didn't feel like it was in alignment with their target market. Who was actually buying the beer?
Hmm.
Who was within that whole target demographic? Maybe they're looking to expand the demographic, but there's other companies out there and they felt the backlash. They started pulling back, and then other companies, whether it's John Deere or Ford or Tractor Supply Company, are all recently just sort of say, oh, you know what, we're pulling back on all our DEI efforts, either scrapping it all together or minimizing it. But that's doing the same thing, but the opposite way.
Yeah.
There is, oh, let's do DEI and let's do everything. That's whether it's in line with their mission or not. And then there's, let's not do any of it. There's two things that are
Hmm.
not going to change. Their clientele is going to become more diverse, especially in America, especially if you're going global. And your talent pool is only going to become more diverse. It's not becoming less so. So if you want to ignore how to deal with differences, it will only impact your company negatively in the future. Give you an example, when John Deere was announcing that they were pulling back from their DEI, at the very same time, they were paying over $1 million for discriminatory hiring practices.
Wow.
It's you can't just there's laws out there. The laws don't
Right.
go well, regardless of what somebody
Your
influenced.
policies, yeah,
The
the
laws
laws
are
do,
still there. You
yeah,
still have to be compliant. Okay,
you're
that's
right.
but then there's also people out there that still want to feel included, still want to feel like they belong. And as we started this conversation out before, is when you're looking at creating more equity and inclusion, how can it impact a greater audience, right? How can
Hmm.
what you do, support the greater audience and support a greater group of people by what you're doing? We talked about the wheelchair ramps. We talked about, parental leave and caregiver leave. When you're looking at these pieces, these policies, how can it support you as the entire audience? And remember your audience. Remember who
Remember
your
the
clients
audience.
are. Remember who your talent pool is. And yes, remember your mission and what it is.
Yes.
And if you're a corporation, your sole mission, if you're a for-profit sole mission, is to continue to make a profit. Because if you don't, you won't be in existence. If your
Right.
nonprofit is to fulfill whatever your mission is. So when we look at, so in our respect, when we're working with companies, is how do you align being inclusive with moving a company forward?
Right.
You can do good and you can be good and do good at the exact same time. But some companies just haven't figured that out.
Right.
And
And
we're
that's a big miss because that is an opportunity for, as you said, it's the alignment and reinforcing the goals of the organization and the bottom line. They're not mutually exclusive. Before we wrap up, let's just, if we can, spend just a couple more minutes on these individuals. So I think so many times, we come into conversations, and in this very charged environment, I think it's very likely that this is happening where we make assumptions about what somebody is thinking or their perception and when we're working on projects together and we're trying to move something forward and perhaps somebody reacts in a way that we don't think is a way we would react to, and all of a sudden we start to get this snowball effect in the judgment that starts to lay blame, and then we really start to find the groups starting to break down and the teams breaking down. And I think that's one of the concerns I have as I think about what may transpire as we come to the other side of this election. And I'm curious if you have maybe some tips or things for people to think about that maybe will help try to help them reframe maybe what's going on and try to find a common place for discussion,
so
commonality.
a great question, and I'll bring something very personal to me into it. So as we mentioned right before this, and something you didn't know, that I was running in a state election. So I'm running for state. I live here in New Hampshire. I was running for state rep. Am running for state rep. That'll be over when this drops. But I can tell you when I would go to our candidate forums, something I would always say, and this first thing or the last thing I would say is everybody at this table, regardless of what party they're on, loves New Hampshire. That's why we're here. That's why we're here. We might think of it a different way to get to that success, and what we think is great for New Hampshire, but we all love New Hampshire. And you just substitute New Hampshire for your state or your organization,
Hmm.
or wherever you are. That understanding and assuming good intent there. They wouldn't be there if they didn't. So assume that good intent. But then understanding that the good intent, you can help clarify. So for individuals that you think that they might have
Hmm.
said something or did something that didn't feel right, you say, what do you mean by that? Like when somebody called, I mentioned calling them kids. Hey, I noticed you call us kids. What do you really mean by that? Because we're obviously not
Right.
kids. What do you mean by calling us kids? And you might find that one, they don't understand, they don't realize they're saying that, or it's really endearing to them because it's a word that
Yes.
just feel because they have kids, and it's something that makes them feel like you're like family, and that's why they're saying it. Um, And I don't think you'll ever find somebody saying that has ill intent, typically. So understand that, clarify when you
Mhm.
when you find out what it is, and in a very nice way. You don't have to beat somebody over the head. You can just say, "Hey, could you speak more to that? Because I don't understand. This is how I took it, but you probably didn't mean it that way." So when you assume good intent, clarify when you're wondering whether it is there or not, um, and then move forward. We talked about that self-awareness engages into and Taylor, and then move forward with that conversation and understand where you are. And when it comes to polarization, realizing that I think both parties love this country and we're talking about
Yes.
this election. If we didn't, we wouldn't be so passionate, right? We would
Right.
be so passionate on both sides, is right, and we are very passionate on both sides if we didn't love it. So let's start
Agreed.
there. Let's start with that premise to move forward and discuss where we are. And again, when you're talking about your organization, use that as your premise as well.
I love that. Thank you so much for this rich discussion. So I think, there's a lot here that we've talked about. And I think as we come through the other side of this election, there'll be more conversations to be had. And I hope that people will take from this, time today, some ways of reinforcing the opportunity inside their organizations, thinking about how to reach out to others and start to have a conversation that can be more that's more around learning and growth. And so from that lens, we have some things that we want to be able to share as we wrap up, and we'll have links in the show notes for our contact information as well as some of these resources. But really, we both want to provide some free resources that are very relevant to this conversation today. And so you'll be able to download the core set from the courage to advance podcast.com. And in that, there'll be, both Mason and I believe very deeply in actionable, tools and experiences that'll allow you to move forward and not just feel just motivated alone, or just the warm and fuzzies aren't enough these days. We want to make sure everybody has something that's really they can apply. So we'll both be providing that. I think Mason, you spoke to wanting to be able to do a little tailoring. Do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts there, because you really wanted it to be personal?
I did it. We discussed like building something ahead of time, but I wanted to see where our conversation went because, as you said, we had a guide of what we're going to talk about, but we didn't exactly know where it would go. So it's something I will build that's bespoke, probably a one-page, based on our conversation here. It'll be very bespoke to our conversation, and it won't be something that's just off the shelf for somebody to download and bring this conversation further, maybe to bring it in with your team as well.
Thank you for being so thoughtful and doing that. And I think that's a very, it'll be a wonderful, wonderful component that people get to take advantage of. And as I mentioned, you'll find the links to everything that we've been able to talk about and how to contact us and to learn more, and links to Mason's books. And I want to, again, thank you so much, Mason, for sharing your insights. Thank you again to the Empathy Edge for hosting our podcast subseries, and to all the listeners for tuning in to this episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about having the courage to find them. Thank you again, Mason, and
Thank
thank
you.
you to
It
everybody
was a
listening.
pleasure. Thank you very much.
For our listeners, we have free resources relevant to our conversation today that you can download by visiting couragetoadvancepodcast.com, which will take you to our Spark Effect podcast page. This particular resource is an exercise called the Connection Compass, designed to be a 360-degree mapping framework that begins with self-reflection and invites conversation with others with the goal of finding common ground and being inclusive to differing perspectives so you can ultimately have thriving relationships and get work done. All of our resources are actionable exercises and tools that are designed to not just inspire, but to move you forward. We encourage our listeners to check it out and let us know what you think.